Okay, Bio 180, as promised, here we go. So we're probably going to be doing or running through pretty quickly the respiratory system as scheduled, and then there is also the vessels. So we'll go ahead and go through the respiratory system in this one. Here you have it. This is the one. It's the chapter 22, part A PowerPoint that we're going to get it started on. I'm going to set this right down here. I don't know that that actually shows very well, but yes, we're going to go on to the respiratory system. Okay. So, major body functions of the respiratory system. 4 big things is probably look really good on a test as far as what are the functions of the respiratory system. It can be a free, like short answer type of thing, supply oxygen to the body, transport carbon dioxide out from the cells back to the lungs, and it also helps you smell, and it helps with speech. Okay, so there's a couple of things that we need to look at when it comes to respiration involving 4 separate processes. There's going to be ventilation. What's interesting is that up until now, you probably remember respiration and ventilation being used interchangeably. Here's the thing. From here on out, ventilation and respiration are 2 different things. So, respiration, the first one is pulmonary ventilation. It's just breathing. So, ventilation simply is movement of air through a closed compartment. So, in this case, it's going to be your lungs. Then you have external respiration, which means the oxygen that gets breathed in, and then it's in the inside of the alveoli by simple diffusion will come through the alveolar membrane into and diffuse into the blood. And the carbon dioxide that has come back through the capillaries after traveling from the right atrium to the right ventricle out to the pulmonary arteries, to the arterioles, to the capillaries in the lungs. What's going to happen is the carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out of the capillaries into the alveoli. So when that makes that swap, that is actually considered external respiration, because respiration is defined as the gas exchange across the membrane. So when that gas exchange occurs, the reason why we use the word external is because the inside of the alveoli is going to be contiguous with the outside world that the environmental, the room air, so to speak. Then you have transport of the oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood. And then you have internal respiration, which is the gas exchange of the oxygen and carbon dioxide between the systemic vessels and the tissues. So the external respiration happens on the pulmonary side of circulation. And then after it switches, you have oxygenated blood, which then goes back to the left atrium through the through the bicuspid, the mitral valve, into the left ventricle, out the aortic valve, through the aorta, and then it's going to go through the various arteries. So it's going to go through the ascending aorta, the arch of the aorta, descending aorta, through the thoracic aorta, and so on and so forth. Then it's going to go through from wherever branch of the aorta to those respective arteries, then to the arterioles and the respective capillary beds, where the byproduct of cellular respiration and breaking down of sugars to produce ATP, which is carbon dioxide, is going to then diffuse out from the cells into the capillaries, and the the oxygen that just came back and that came through the blood is going to diffuse out into the cells. And that swap is going to occur, which renders the blood that just came in deoxygenated, which will then go through from the capillary beds to the venules, then the veins, and then eventually through the superior and or inferior vena cava, and then out, dump into the right atrium again, and so on and so forth. So as you can see up on top, the top two processes of respiration, the pulmonary ventilation and the external respiration, happens in the respiratory system, and the transport and the internal respiration happens in the circulatory system. So a couple of things. This is an important slide, as simple as it may seem. You're going to see the major organs that's involved in the respiratory system goes from the nose and the nasal cavity through the paranasal sinuses, then the pharynx, which then constitutes the upper respiratory tract. So the pharynx, as you recall, is what we commonly, call the throat. Then you have the pharyngolaryngeal line, which is the line of demarcation that separates the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. So then we have the larynx, then the trachea, and the bronchi, and the branches, and then the lungs and alveoli ultimately, which then constitutes the lower respiratory tract. So this is why when we try to determine whether it's an upper respiratory tract infection or when it goes down into the lungs, it becomes pneumonia. It becomes a little bit more alarming because now we have more involvement and it gets closer and closer to the circulatory system. And if given the opportunity, it's allowed, any kind of pathogens that may enter, it increases the chances of having, sepsis and system-wide infection. So make friends with this diagram. I like it. And if I like it, you probably should too. Okay, for you table people, I really do like this table too. It gives you, the description and function. That's slide 6 on your, we should keep it this way. Slide 6 on your PowerPoint presentation. 6 and 7. Moving onward, we're going to this is slide 8. For those of you who are just listening, the nose and paranasal sinuses. The nose is it's the only external portion of the respiratory system. What's interesting is that the paranasal sinuses are kept, the sinuses are there for multiple reasons. It's there for resonance of your voice, of course, and then there's it allows for space when you have any kind of mucosal overload or secretions, and it also lightens the load of your head because your head's pretty heavy. Functions of the nose is going to be providing an airway for respiration, of course. The turbinates and the concha are going to be, when you breathe in, it actually turns, it kind of churns the air and exposes it to the mucosa and the warmth. And so what it's going to do is moisten and warms the entering air. It's going to filter and clean the inspired air and serves as the resonating chamber for speech. It also houses the olfactory receptors. I don't know if we actually talked about this piece, but in order for you to smell something, you actually have to have a small piece of whatever substance it is make contact with the receptors in your nose, in your nostrils. And so that actually has to then go through the cribriform plate, if you recall, and then up into the cranial vault. And so now the cells, the cell bodies, and they all consolidate up top at the olfactory bulb, which is cranial nerve 1, on either side of the crista galli. I'm sure this is review from Anatomy and Physiology 1 last semester for all of you. And, nice tidbit is 90% of your tasting, any kind of gustatory situation, is actually smell. It's divided into 2 regions, the external nose and then the nasal cavity. The external nose, we need to talk about the root. This is the area between the eyebrows, the bridge, right? And the dorsum nasi, and then the anterior margin, and the apex, which is the tip of the nose. You have this guy here, the surface anatomy. And the nares are bound laterally by the alae, which are wings. And you have the cartilaginous portions that kind of keep the nostrils open. The external nose is formed by nasal and frontal bones superiorly, from the bridge and the root, respectively. You also get the maxillary bones that contribute to the nose laterally, and the plates of hyaline cartilage inferiorly. So please make friends with this picture. That's a good one. I also like this one too, the side profile, because there's so many different components that can be tested on. So the nasal cavity is within the posterior, within and posterior to the external nose. It's divided by the midline or the nasal septum. The septum is formed anteriorly by septal cartilage, and then posteriorly by the vomer bone, and then the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. These are important. Posterior, the nasal apertures or the concha, they're the opening where the nasal cavity turns into the nasopharynx. So they're quite a bit more posterior, as you can see in this picture. The roof is formed by the ethmoid and sphenoid bones, and the floor are formed by the hard palate and the soft palate. The hard palate are absolutely formed by the maxillary and the palatine bones. So the anterior portion of the hard palate is the maxillary bone. The posterior portion of the hard palate is the palatine bone then. And posterior to that further is going to be the soft palate, which then is contiguous with the uvula. Okay. The nasal vestibule is the nasal cavity superior to the nostril. I just need you to know them as nasal hairs. If you like vibrissae, that's fine. Filter. Hairs are going to be sufficient for the purpose of this test. Rest of the nasal cavity lined with mucous membranes. You're going to have the olfactory mucosa, which is a superior region, like we said, contains olfactory epithelium. Then you have the respiratory mucosa, which is pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium with goblet cells, which means it looks like multiple layers, but it actually is one layer. And you have columnar cells with little hairs on the edge, and it has goblet cells, which means that it's secreting, gland secreting tissue. It rests on the lamina propria, containing seromucous nasal glands. So the seromucous nasal glands are going to have mucus-secreting mucus cells, and what gives that away is the fact that they're goblet cells in the middle of the membrane itself. The mucus and the serous secretions has lysozyme and defensins, which help protect, because it is contiguous with the outside world. It's dark in there and it's moist in there, and it's prime breeding ground for potential pathogens, things of that nature. So it's really helpful to have that portion of the innate immune system kind of kick in for you. You have the ciliated cells. They sweep contaminated mucus posteriorly towards the throat, and the inspired air is warmed by the plexuses of capillaries and veins in the nasal cavity. Nasal mucosa contains many sensory nerve endings that can cause sneezing and force particles out of the cavity. So what's interesting too is that this is also occurring in the lungs as well. So the ciliated epithelium is going to constantly move the mucus, because it has to be thin enough that it doesn't get stuck, so that you don't get like a breeding ground for bacteria there. And it has to be thin. Oh yeah, so it has to be thin enough to kind of continue to wash things over, but thick enough so that it actually does form a protective layer. That's it. So the concha are scroll-like mucosa-covered projections that that protrude medially. So it kind of comes inward and scrolls. There's 3 sections, as you can see on this picture. There's the superior, middle, and inferior concha. The nasal meatus is the groove inferior to each concha. So this is anytime they're talking about a meatus, like external auditory or acoustic meatus, there's going to be a tunnel involved. So that's the tunnel that's formed by the scroll. Shape of the concha help to increase mucosal area, so it increases surface area because it's a scroll, and it enhances air turbulence so that you are able to warm and moisten air more efficiently. Yep. During inhalation, concha and nasal mucosa filter heat and moisten air, and during the exhalation, they reclaim the heat and moisture. So the paranasal sinuses we talked about, it forms a ring around the nasal cavities. Make friends with this picture. So just in case you can't see it, the green is the frontal sinus. The blue are the ethmoid sinuses. The nasal cavity is in the middle. The large purple areas, that's most commonly palpated. So the frontal sinuses and the maxillary sinuses are often palpated to rule out sinusitis because of an infection, because that's the most common places you'll have it, and where you can kind of access and reproduce pain there to confirm. On the side view, the red jelly bean looking figure is the sphenoid sinus. You will need to know those. You talked about lightening the skull, secreting mucus, and helping to warm and moisten air. Which then brings us to the pharynx. Actually, we'll stop this recording and then we can start back up again with the pharynx.